Step into Regency, England, in a world of quiet longing, family duty, whispered scandal, and unexpected love. Every story offers another journey into romance. So settle in, dear listener, and let this Regency romance audiobook carry you into a time of elegance, emotion, and romance. The story begins now. Chapter 1. Arrival. England, 1814. The road from Hampshire to Wiltshire felt longer than Lord Ashcombe remembered. Perhaps it was the heat inside the carriage. Perhaps it was the dust that clung to the windows and settled in the creases of his gloves. Or perhaps a road grew longer when a man travelled it for the first time to meet the young woman he was expected to marry, though he knew her only from 3 careful letters and his father's promises. He had come from Hampshire in his own carriage, changing horses at Andover and again along the Wiltshire road, and by the second afternoon the country had softened around him. Chalk hills opened into gentler slopes. Hedgerows, heavy with late blackberries, leaned over the road. The harvest had been cut, and the fields lay stubbled and golden beneath the clean September sky. It was the first week of the month, and the weather had granted him 3 bright days in a row. Edmund sat with his hat on his knee and his collecting case at his feet. For 100 miles he had been trying to summon some suitable feeling. Anticipation, perhaps. Tenderness, if a man could be tender toward a woman he had never met. Gratitude, at least, for the marriage portion that would mend more fences at Ashcombe Park than sentiment ever could. Instead, he was aware that the carriage was too warm, that his collar had begun to chafe, and that 3 letters in 2 years was a thin offering to a young lady who had been promised to him and had never once seen his face. The wedding was to take place in 3 weeks. His father had agreed the principal terms before his death. The lawyers had spent the better part of 2 years turning promises into parchment, and Edmund had finally been summoned to Wiltshire to marry the bride chosen for him. He had written when courtesy required it. He had wished Miss Wrenfield good health. He had hoped her family prospered. He had praised the gardens at Wrenfield Hall, because his mother had once described them as among the finest in Wiltshire, years before illness narrowed her world to the south drawing-room at Ashcombe Park. Beyond that, he had found himself staring at the blank paper with the helplessness of a man trying to converse with a portrait. It was difficult to write much more to a person whose laugh he had never heard. The arrangement had been his father's, made 2 years earlier, in the autumn when the trouble at Ashcombe Park first began to show itself in the ledgers. Rents came late. A tenant roof needed repair. 2 stretches of boundary fencing had gone soft with rot, and the south meadow flooded every March because no one had paid to clear the ditch. His father had gone to London that season and renewed an acquaintance with Mr. Wrenfield, a prosperous Wiltshire gentleman whose elder daughter was said to be very beautiful and very accomplished. The 2 men had met at dinners, at card tables, and in the useful little conversations that took place after other guests had begun to yawn and call for their carriages. By November, Lord Ashcombe had returned to Hampshire with the agreement settled, a respectable engagement, a wedding to follow once the settlements were complete, and a marriage portion large enough to steady the estate. When told, Edmund had nodded and said what a dutiful son was expected to say. His father had looked relieved, almost proud. By the time the letters were exchanged and the engagement announced, his father's health was failing, the estate was demanding every hour Edmund could give it, and Miss Iris Wrenfield remained a name written in a careful hand on thick cream paper. 6 months later, his father was dead, and Edmund had inherited the title, the estate, the debts, and the promise of a bride he had never met. His mother had been gone for years, and there was no one left at Ashcombe Park to be relieved by anything he did. He shifted in his seat and looked out at the hedgerow passing the window. A low stone wall ran beside the road, half swallowed by grass. Near the bank, a flat slab leaned at an angle, its underside dark with damp. Edmund rapped on the roof. The carriage slowed. The coachman called down from the box.
"My lord." "A moment, Haynes. I shan't be long."
Edmund stepped down into the road. Warm dust rose around his boots as he walked back to the wall. He crouched beside the flat stone, lifted it carefully with both hands, and turned it over in the practiced manner of a man who had done the same thing in lanes, meadows, orchards, and churchyards since boyhood. Something dark moved beneath it. A small beetle ran for the shadow. Edmund opened the collecting case at his feet, took out a small glass jar, and caught the beetle neatly inside. He stoppered it and held it up to the light. He was smiling. Pterosticus medidus, common. He had 100 of them already. Still, it was a handsome specimen, glossy and dark, with clean ridges along the wing cases and legs that moved briskly against the glass. He crouched again, eased the beetle back beneath the stone, and returned the slab carefully to its place, leaving a finger's breadth of shadow for the creature to find its way. Then he wiped the jar with his handkerchief, set it back in the collecting case, and climbed into the carriage. In his small, even hand, he noted the date, the road, the condition of the soil, and the species. Haynes, who had been with the Ashcombe family long enough to be past surprise, gave the horses their heads. The carriage rolled on into Wiltshire. Wrenfield Hall stood at the end of a mile-long avenue of beeches. Their leaves had not yet turned, but the green had begun to dull at the edges, and the afternoon light slipped through them in broad, shifting bars. He saw the house first through the carriage window, a long, pale front of weathered stone, tall sash windows bright with sun, and shallow steps leading to a polished black door. It was larger than he had expected, and there was no sign, from roofline to gravel sweep, of neglect. The gravel had been freshly raked. Stone urns at the steps overflowed with late roses. The lawns were close-mown, and not a nettle showed above the borders where a guest might see it. Here was a house, Edmund thought, that had never had to choose between mending a stable roof and paying a steward. He understood, as the carriage drew up, why his father had returned home so satisfied. A footman opened the carriage door before Edmund had reached for the handle. Edmund stepped down onto the gravel and followed him up the shallow steps, where the butler waited at the open front door. A moment later he was inside a stone-flagged hall, where the air was several degrees cooler than the road. Mr. Wrenfield met him at the foot of the staircase. He was a stout, ruddy gentleman in his 50s, dressed for the country in a brown coat, polished boots, and a waistcoat that pulled slightly across his middle. He greeted Edmund with hearty good humour, the manner of a man accustomed to comfort, good dinners, and neighbours who laughed at his stories.
Lord Ashcombe, welcome to Wrenfield. You have had a fair journey, I trust?
Very fair, sir. The weather has been kind.
It has, it has. Mrs. Wrenfield is in the drawing-room, and we're all impatient to make you acquainted. Come up.
Mr. Wrenfield stayed only long enough to see Edmund received by his wife. Then a footman appeared with some message from the steward, and Mr. Wrenfield excused himself with hearty apologies, promising to return before dinner. Mrs. Wrenfield rose as he entered the drawing-room. She was a small, neat woman with fair colouring, pale brows, and eyes that moved quickly from his face to his coat, his gloves, his boots, and back again. Her welcome was pleasant, but carefully measured. She gave him a warm smile, held his hand for just long enough, asked after his journey and his health, and seated him by the long window where the afternoon light was best. Within 5 minutes she had mentioned the beauty of the house, the families who visited it, and the many accomplishments of her elder daughter, all so gently that each boast arrived dressed as conversation.
"Iris has been with her maid this last hour,"
Mrs. Wrenfield said, pouring tea from a silver pot.
"You must forgive a young woman her preparations on such a day. She has talked of little else all morning."
Of course.
Edmund said. He accepted the cup and answered Mrs. Wrenfield's questions with as much ease as he could manage. Through the window, the park lay golden in the afternoon light. Somewhere deep in the house, a door opened and closed. Then came the sound of light footsteps on the marble stair. Mrs. Wrenfield's face softened with satisfaction. The drawing-room door opened, and Iris Wrenfield came in. At first glance, she was exactly what Edmund had been told to expect. A moment later, he understood why every description of her had fallen short. She was of average height, slender, and beautifully poised, with a lifted chin and a graceful, unhurried carriage. Her hair was a soft golden blonde, parted in the centre and dressed high in braided coils, with a few delicate ringlets at her temples. Her face was smooth and delicately formed, with a clear brow, pale blue eyes, a straight nose, and a soft coral mouth. Her complexion was fair and luminous, touched with a gentle rose in the cheeks. She wore a high-waisted afternoon gown of pale primrose silk, the bodice and short sleeves trimmed with fine cream lace, a darker sash tied beneath the bust, and a single strand of small pearls at her throat. She moved with calm assurance, as if she had long been accustomed to admiration and saw no reason to object to it. She crossed the carpet, offered Edmund her hand, and smiled. It was a lovely smile, carefully shaped, and it did not quite warm her eyes.
Lord Ashcombe, how good of you to come so far.
The pleasure is entirely mine, Miss Wrenfield.
He bowed over her hand and released it. She seated herself with care, smoothed her skirt with the ease of long practice, and asked after his journey. Her manner was perfectly bred, her voice was sweet, and her questions were graceful enough, though each one allowed him only the sort of answer politeness required. Edmund answered, and Iris nodded. A small silence followed, which she filled with a light remark about the unusual fineness of the weather. When Edmund agreed, another silence came, slightly longer than the first. Iris folded her hands in her lap and glanced once toward her mother. Mrs. Wrenfield's smile remained in place, though a faint line appeared between her brows. Then Iris turned back to Edmund with an expression of graceful regret.
I am truly distressed to be obliged to leave you so soon after your arrival. My dearest friend, Sophia Carrington, has been ill these 3 weeks, and I promised faithfully to call on her this afternoon. Her own sister is in Bath, and she has been sadly short of company. I could not disappoint her. You will understand.
Nothing in her face suggested distress.
Of course, I should be sorry to keep you from a friend who is unwell.
Charlotte will keep you company. She knows the house and gardens thoroughly, and will make you quite comfortable until I return.
Iris turned toward her mother.
Mama, where is Charlotte?
In the small library, my dear. She is finishing those letters for me.
Will you send for her? Lord Ashcombe must not be left to entertain himself on his first day with us.
Mrs. Wrenfield rang the bell. Iris turned the conversation to the gardens and described them with charm for several minutes. She spoke of the South Walk, the rose border, the wilderness path, and the new plantation, pausing longest over an Italian urn that had come from London at considerable expense. Edmund inclined his head at the proper moments and made the necessary replies. Before Charlotte could appear, a footman entered and bowed.
The carriage is at the door, ma'am.
Iris was already on her feet. Mrs. Wrenfield rose beside her, the faint line between her brows smoothing at once into a hostess's smile.
Then we must not keep Sophia waiting,
Mrs. Wrenfield said.
Lord Ashcombe, you will forgive me for a moment. I must see Iris properly away.
Both ladies explained Sophia Carrington's illness with such united elegance that Edmund found himself standing, bowing, assuring them twice that he would do very well, and hoping aloud that Miss Carrington might soon recover. Iris gave him her hand once more.
You are very good. I shall hope to find you settled when I return.
The primrose silk rustled softly as Iris left the room, Mrs. Wrenfield following close behind with the anxious dignity of a woman determined that even an awkward departure should look intentional. Edmund remained by the window for some minutes after the door closed. The sound of the carriage wheels on the gravel reached him faintly and then faded, and a thrush in the rose border spoke once and was silent. He set his cup on the small table at his elbow. She was very beautiful. That was true and not to be argued with. She was graceful, well-spoken, and the daughter of a house that had clearly waited a long time for the half-hour that had just passed so smoothly. He could find no fault in any part of it, yet nothing in the meeting had taken hold. It was as though he had been shown a portrait in a long gallery, admired its beauty, and walked on, only to find that no living impression of the woman remained. He was still considering this when the door opened behind him. Chapter 2. The Walk. A young woman appeared in the doorway, carrying a small bundle of letters. When she saw Edmund standing alone by the window, she stopped short, as though she had expected to find her mother still with him.
I beg your pardon. Mamma sent for me, but I did not know she had left you alone.
She held the letters a little tighter against her side, then smoothed her expression into politeness.
Please come in. I am sorry Mrs. Wrenfield was called away before you arrived.
Edmund said. The young woman drew a small breath, gathered herself, and came into the room. She set the letters on a side table, then looked at him with the careful calm of a person summoned without warning to perform a household duty.
I am Charlotte Wrenfield. I shall keep you company, if you will allow it, until my mother is free again.
You are most kind, Miss Wrenfield.
Not at all. I am quite used to being called upon.
She said it lightly, as if it were no more than a household habit, and turned at once to ring for fresh tea. She was perhaps 2 years younger than her sister and near the same height, though more lightly built. Her hair was a warm walnut brown, parted in the centre and gathered simply at the nape. A few loose curls had escaped at her temples. Her face was heart-shaped, with high cheekbones, a soft chin, a small straight nose, and a mouth with more expression in it than she seemed willing to show. Her eyes were a clear hazel brown beneath finely arched brows. Her complexion was fair, with a natural rose in her cheeks, as if she had only lately come in from the garden. She wore a plain gown of pale blue muslin, long-sleeved and high at the neck, with no ornament beyond a narrow ribbon at the waist. Compared with her sister's primrose silk, it was a modest thing, but it suited her. Its simplicity suited the quiet care with which she held herself. A maid came in with fresh tea and a small plate of ratafia biscuits, crisp and pale, with the faint scent of almonds. Charlotte thanked her and waited until the door had closed before she poured. Her hands were steady, and as she lifted the teapot, Edmund noticed a small ink stain along the side of her left forefinger. She offered Edmund a cup, then the plate.
You must be in want of something after the road. Did you come by Andover or by Salisbury?
By Andover.
Edmund said, accepting a biscuit.
Then I hope the inn remains tolerable. Papa says the beds are better than the coffee, though I have never been in a position to judge either.
He smiled despite himself, and she seemed encouraged enough to continue. She asked whether the roads had been much troubled by dust after so many dry days, and whether the last stage had tired the horses. After a few minutes, he found that he was answering her at greater length than he had answered her sister. Not because Charlotte pressed him, for she did not. She gave him room. She listened, and because she listened, he found himself saying more. He told her, eventually, about the stop at the stone wall. He had not meant to mention it. It was not a drawing-room subject, certainly not within the first hour of acquaintance. But she had asked whether anything along the road had delayed him, and he had said, almost before he could prevent himself, that he had stopped the carriage to turn over a stone. Charlotte looked at him.
To turn over a stone?
For a beetle. I collect them. Ground beetles, chiefly. I am attempting a catalogue of the ground beetles found in my own county, but once one begins looking under stones, it becomes difficult to stop.
He waited for the polite blankness. He knew it well. It usually appeared around the word beetle, if not before. Charlotte set down her cup.
What did you find?
Edmund looked at her.
A common species. Pterosticus madidus. I have a great many of them already.
Pterosticus madidus,
she repeated carefully. She got the syllables right. It was absurdly small, yet it warmed him like the first coal catching in a cold grate. He looked down at his cup, then up again, and found her gazing through the long window toward the park. She was not smiling, but something in her expression had changed. She seemed to be listening to him still, even after he had stopped speaking. Mrs. Wrenfield returned before the tea had cooled, smiling with renewed composure and apologizing for having left Lord Ashcombe even for a moment. Charlotte rose at once.
If you have no further need of me, Mamma, I shall finish the letters.
Yes, my dear. Do not forget Mrs. Carrington's note.
Charlotte gathered the letters from the side table. At the door, she paused only long enough to say,
You are very welcome to Wrenfield, Lord Ashcombe.
She said it simply, without arrangement or performance. Then she was gone. Dinner that evening was long, handsome and carefully pleasant. Iris returned in time to dress, wearing rose silk and a pearl comb in her fair hair, and spoke of Sophia Carrington's illness with gentle, well-managed concern. Mr. Wrenfield was hearty over the soup, Mrs. Wrenfield attentive over every silence, and Edmund found himself answering all the proper questions with all the proper replies. Charlotte sat halfway down the table, quiet and composed. Later, after the ladies had withdrawn, Charlotte slipped away to the small library. On the upper shelf she found the old county natural history. She searched until she found the name, then traced the Latin with one finger until she was certain of the spelling. That night, in her room, Charlotte Wrenfield sat at a small writing desk with a single candle burning beside her. She opened her leather-bound book, dipped her pen, and held her hand above the page for a long moment. Then she wrote one line.
Terostitius Madidus. He said the name as though it mattered.
She closed the book, placed it in the drawer, and blew out the candle before she could be tempted to write more. The next morning came in bright and cool, with a light dew still on the grass when Edmund came down to breakfast. Mrs. Wrenfield met him at the table with apologies. Iris had been called away again. Sophia Carrington had passed an indifferent night, Mrs. Wrenfield explained, and Iris could not possibly neglect a sick friend at such a time. Mr. Wrenfield was at the home farm. Charlotte would be very glad to walk Lord Ashcombe in the gardens, if he wished it. Charlotte knew the gardens better than anyone in the house. Charlotte came down a quarter of an hour later in a plain straw bonnet and a light shawl, with the ink mark gone from her finger. She greeted him without ceremony, and said her father had particularly wished Lord Ashcombe to see the ha-ha and the new plantation, though the kitchen garden was nearer, if he preferred to begin there.
The kitchen garden, then, if you do not object,
Edmund said. Charlotte looked almost pleased.
Not at all. It is more interesting than the plantation, though I would not advise you to tell Papa so.
They went out through the door at the end of the long passage. The morning smelled of cut hay from beyond the wall. They crossed the lawn past the ha-ha, the sunken wall that kept a sheep from the garden without interrupting the view. Beyond it, the new plantation stood in tidy young rows, each sapling staked and tied as carefully as a schoolboy's cravat. Charlotte named it dutifully, then led him on toward the kitchen garden. At its far end, a low wall of weathered stone divided the beds from a paddock running down to a stream. Charlotte stopped beside it. She did not look at him.
I have been thinking, Lord Ashcombe, that if you cared to look beneath the third or fourth stone from the corner, there might be something worth your notice. I cannot promise, but the wall is old and it faces the right way.
Edmund looked at her. She had said it carefully, as a person might say a thing she had rehearsed and was not entirely sure about.
Miss Wrenfield, did you walk down here yesterday to look?
I walked down here this morning, before breakfast.
A faint colour came into her face.
I did not turn any of the stones. I only thought you might wish to.
He crouched. He turned the third stone from the corner, then the fourth. Beneath the fourth, a long-bodied beetle with a copper-brown sheen ran for the grass and was gone before he could put his hand to it. He sat back on his heels in the dew.
I have not seen that one before.
Then I am glad I did not turn the stone myself.
He stood, dusted his hands, and looked beyond the garden wall, where the ground rose toward the pale line of the chalk downs.
Do you ever walk on the downs above the house, Miss Wrenfield?
Often. I've walked there since I was a girl.
Then I should be grateful for your guidance. Chalk soil sometimes gives shelter to species one does not find in wetter ground, and I should not know where to begin without someone who knows the paths.
She looked toward the rising land, then back at him.
I could show you the old sheep track tomorrow morning, if you wished.
I should wish it very much.
A robin called from the apple tree behind them, sharp and insistent, and they both seemed to remember the garden around them. Iris returned shortly before the dressing bell, flushed from the drive and with a great deal to say. She had spent the greater part of the day at Carrington Place. Sophia had been brave but very low. The doctor had been twice. There was talk of Bath, or of the sea, as soon as Sophia could be moved. Iris told it all with the air of a woman who had spent the afternoon very near the centre of a small private drama and had returned pleased with her own consequence. At dinner she wore soft amber silk embroidered at the hem with small cream flowers, and she sat opposite Edmund at the long table with a candelabrum between them that cast a warm light over her face and throat. Mr. Wrenfield, between the soup and the fish, asked Edmund whether he had had a tolerable morning, and Edmund said he had walked in the gardens with Miss Charlotte and found the grounds very fine.
Charlotte knows every nettle in the place.
Iris said, smiling.
She is very thorough in such matters. I dare say no wall or pathway escaped her notice.
She showed me the kitchen garden, and we went as far as the wall by the paddock.
Oh, the paddock wall. There is nothing to see there. It is only the way down to the stream, and the stream itself is hardly worth the trouble. Mamma, you remember when Mr. Lyle came in the spring, while he was still so very attentive, and went down to the stream and tore his coat on the bramble? He could not be brought to forgive us for a fortnight.
Mrs. Wrenfield remembered. The story occupied the next several minutes, Iris telling it with great spirit and a quick smile at the close. Mr. Wrenfield chuckled and reached for his glass.
Poor Lyle. He came here meaning to be irresistible and left blaming a bramble for his defeat.
Iris laughed, and the table laughed with her, as people often did when Iris made laughter feel like the proper response. When the laughter had passed off, the conversation thinned for a moment as the fish plates were removed. Charlotte, who had been quiet through most of the meal, looked across at Edmund.
Lord Ashcombe, were you able to return to the kitchen garden wall with your collecting glass?
Iris turned toward her.
Collecting glass? What could Lord Ashcombe possibly want with a collecting glass in the kitchen garden?
A beetle,
Edmund said.
I went back after luncheon and found it again. It is not one I have taken before.
Iris's smile faltered for the first time that evening.
A beetle?
A ground beetle, chiefly found under stones and in damp places. This one was sheltering beneath the fourth stone from the corner.
How very industrious of it.
Iris said, recovering herself with a small laugh.
I confess I prefer my garden creatures at a greater distance.
Mr. Wrenfield chuckled.
There, Ashcombe, you have found Charlotte's kingdom. If there is a damp wall, a crooked path, or a cabbage patch within 10 miles, she will know it.
Then I am fortunate in my guide.
Edmund said. Charlotte looked surprised, as if she had not expected him to say so. Later, in his room, Edmund stood at the open window. The moon was up, and somewhere in the beech avenue an owl called once, then again. His small notebook lay open on the sill, the pencil resting across the blank page. He had meant to record the beetle from the kitchen garden wall. He had meant to write of copper-brown wing cases, damp stone, and chalk soil. These were the sort of details that had always quieted his mind. Tonight they would not come. Instead, he remembered Charlotte Wrenfield saying Pteristicus medidus as though the name mattered. He remembered the ink stain on her finger, the steady way she had poured his tea, and the careful way she had offered him the plate of ratafia biscuits before asking about the road. At last he wrote one word.
Charlotte.
Then he shut the notebook rather more quickly than necessary. In 3 weeks he was to marry her sister. Chapter 3. Specimens. The rain began in the small hours and was steady by breakfast. Edmund stood at the long window of the breakfast room with a cup of coffee gone cool in his hand and watched the chalk downs disappear behind grey. The beech avenue had darkened in the rain. A blackbird on the gravel turned over a wet leaf, found nothing worth having, and hopped away. He had slept badly, knew the reason, and had no intention of naming it before he had finished his coffee. Mrs. Wrenfield came in, apologising for the weather as though she had ordered it herself. Mr. Wrenfield was already gone to the home farm in his oldest coat, undeterred. Iris came down to breakfast in pale rose muslin, with her fair hair tied by a fresh ribbon, but she did not linger. Mrs. Wrenfield explained that several letters required answers, and no young woman could be expected to walk out in such a downpour. Iris agreed, with a graceful glance toward the rain, and withdrew to her sitting room. Mrs. Wrenfield said Charlotte would be down presently. She came down in fine grey wool, with a small white collar, and her hair drawn back more plainly than the day before. She greeted Edmund without ceremony, glanced once at the rain on the window, and said,
I am sorry I cannot show you the sheep track this morning.
So am I. I confess I'd been looking forward to being shown it by someone who knows the ground.
Edmund said.
The sheep track is easiest in early September, before the autumn mud begins. Another morning will do as well.
Another morning, then. I shall hold you to it.
She seemed to consider the room for a moment, and then she said, with a small hesitation that he had not heard from her before,
If you have nothing better to do this morning, Lord Ashcombe, I could show you the library. It is not a grand room, but there are some old things in it that you might like.
I would be glad of it.
She did not quite smile. She led him out through the hall and along a passage hung with prints of horses, and opened a door at the far end. The library was a long, low room where a maid was kneeling at the hearth to lay the fire. The maid curtsied and went out, leaving the smell of new kindling behind her. The walls were lined to the ceiling with books in dark leather, and a long table stood down the centre, with an unlit argand lamp and a brass paper knife at one end. 2 tall windows looked onto a wet lawn. The room smelled of old paper, faint damp, and the lavender someone had laid among the older volumes long ago. Charlotte moved into it as though she knew where everything was. She walked to a tall ladder against the south wall, steadied it with one hand, and went up 3 rungs to bring down a heavy quarto bound in faded green.
This was my grandfather's,
She said, setting it on the long table.
It is a county natural history. It is not very good, but it is the only natural history of Wiltshire I know.
She turned the pages without looking for the place. The book opened to a section near the middle, and her finger went to the line with the confidence of someone who had found it before. To Rusticus Medidus, the entry read, in close 18th century type. Common throughout the county, beneath stones in damp situations. A small, rather crude woodcut of a beetle sat in the margin. Edmund looked at the page, then at Charlotte. She had found the name for herself. He said only,
It is a fair likeness, considering.
The woodcut is not bad. The Latin is sometimes wrong elsewhere in the book. My grandfather was a country gentleman, not a scholar.
He valued this one, though.
He owned a great many books. He did not always read them, but he read this one.
She closed the volume gently and left it on the table. They walked a slow circuit of the room. She showed him a shelf of old sermons that nobody had opened in 50 years, and a small case of folios on country sport, and a low shelf near the window where the books were newer and the spines less stiff. Charlotte touched the edge of one volume.
These are mine,
She said, as if the admission were of no consequence. He looked at the titles. A book of botany, a volume of Cowper, a pocket Virgil, a small grey book on the geology of the chalk that had clearly been read more than once. She did not press anything on him. After a quarter of an hour she said her mother would want her, and she left him in the library with the fire now burning and the rain steady against the long windows. He stood at the shelf of her books for some time after she had gone. At luncheon the rain had not let up. Mr. Wrenfield was still out, and the party at table was smaller than it had been at dinner. Iris had come down for the meal, with the air of a woman who had achieved a great deal of correspondence. Mrs. Wrenfield was attentive. The footman moved quietly between them. Since leaving the library, Edmund had been considering how to repay the morning's kindness without seeming to single Charlotte out. He waited until the cold meats, pickled walnuts, and a dish of buttered potatoes had been set on the table, and then said, more easily than he had expected,
I wonder, Mrs. Wrenfield, whether Miss Iris and Miss Charlotte would care to see my collecting case this afternoon. I left the larger specimen cases at home, but I brought a few examples with me that may be of some interest. Since the rain has kept us indoors, I should be glad to repay a little of your hospitality.
Mrs. Wrenfield's face arranged itself with quick pleasure.
What a charming idea. Iris, you must go, of course.
Of course.
Iris said, smiling.
I should be delighted, Lord Ashcombe. I am sure you have brought all manner of wonders with you.
Her tone made curiosity sound very like good manners. Charlotte said nothing, but Mrs. Wrenfield had already turned to her with an expectant smile, and so the matter was settled. After luncheon, Edmund went up to the small sitting room that had been given him off the south corridor, opened the shutters against the grey afternoon, set the case on the writing table, and lifted out the shallow tray of his most recent work. He set out 2 chairs by the table, then, after a moment's thought, brought a third from the wall. The sisters came together, with Iris a step ahead. She stood in the doorway, glanced at the case, wrinkled her nose almost imperceptibly at the camphor, noticed the small notebook lying open at a sketch of a beetle's underside, and came in smiling.
Dear me, Lord Ashcombe, it is quite a laboratory.
It is only a working table.
She moved closer. She admired, with real grace, a green tiger beetle that Edmund had brought with him as a comparison specimen, asking whether it had really been that colour when alive. He said it had, brighter, if anything. She admired a second beetle out of politeness and found nothing to say about the third.
And they are all quite dead, I suppose?
Quite.
How peaceful for them.
Edmund inclined his head. Iris turned over the small enamel pin at her wrist, glanced toward the window where the rain had thinned to a fine drizzle, and remembered, with regret, a letter that would miss the afternoon post if she delayed another minute.
You will forgive me. Mamma will scold me dreadfully if it is not in the bag by 3. Charlotte, you will stay and keep Lord Ashcombe company, will you not? You are so much better at this sort of thing than I am. If Lord Ashcombe does not mind.
I do not mind at all.
Iris pressed Edmund's hand very lightly in passing and went out, her silk skirts whispering into the corridor. Charlotte did not move from where she had been standing by the window. She waited a moment, as if to be sure the room had settled, and then she came to the table.
May I see what you have?
Please.
She sat in the chair he had brought from the wall. He sat opposite. He moved the shallow tray of specimens between them and began to explain, not from the beginning of the whole project, which would have been tedious, but from the case in front of her, where everything could be seen. He told her about the county catalogue at Ashcombe. 540 entries now, in his own hand, with locations and dates and soil notes. He told her about the numbered tags, the system he had borrowed from a correspondent in Edinburgh and adapted, the way each capture was logged before it was pinned and set. He told her he had been at it for 4 years. She listened carefully. Once she asked what happened to a specimen that matched no entry in the catalogue, and he gave her a full answer. Later she asked whether he kept the specimens that came to nothing, and he answered that too, without smiling at the phrase. She asked nothing idly. Every question had been considered before it was spoken. He showed her the notebook, the small drawings in pencil, the dates, the locations in his small, even hand. She asked if she might turn the pages, and he said yes. She turned them slowly, and Edmund noticed that a new ink mark was on her finger. Near the back of the notebook she came to a fresh page where he had written only a heading and left the rest blank. Wiltshire, September. Below it, nothing. She looked at the heading for a moment, and then she looked at him.
You meant to continue your record of specimens while you were here.
I meant to try.
I am glad.
She turned no further. She closed the notebook gently and pushed it back across the table to him.
I hope you find what you are truly looking for.
So do I.
They sat for a moment. The rain had quite stopped. A square of pale sun fell across the corner of the writing table and caught in the glass jar of camphor he used for the specimens, and the wet beech avenue below the window began to steam. Charlotte rose, thanked him quietly for showing her the specimens, and left before the silence between them could become difficult. Edmund stood at the window for a long time after she had gone. He did not return to the case. He did not open the notebook. His gaze went once to the third chair he had brought from the wall before the sisters came up. Iris had stood the whole time she was in the room. That night Charlotte Wrenfield sat at her small writing desk with a single candle burning beside her. She opened her leather-bound book, dipped her pen, and held her hand above the page for longer than she had held it the first time. Then she wrote, in her clear, careful hand.
He answered my questions as though they deserved answers.
She closed the book, placed it in the drawer, and blew out the candle. Chapter 4. Meadow. The expedition had begun as Charlotte's quiet offer in the kitchen garden, but by dinner the evening before, it had become a family arrangement. Mr. Wrenfield heard of the plan between the soup and the fish, championed it at once, and Mrs. Wrenfield began arranging the practicalities before the plates had been changed.
The downs above the house
Mr. Wrenfield declared.
are the finest in the county. Ashcombe, you must see them while the weather holds. Charlotte will show you the sheep track, and Iris will go, of course.
Of course.
Iris said, smiling as if the prospect delighted her. Mrs. Wrenfield began counting off the necessary arrangements. There would be a hamper, a footman to carry it, and the gig sent up to the top of the lane to bring them back at 1. Iris would take her parasol against the sun.
And Lord Ashcombe must wear his oldest boots,
Mrs. Wrenfield added.
for the chalk is not kind to leather.
At breakfast the next morning, Iris did not appear. Mrs. Wrenfield came down in some agitation. The dressmaker had arrived from Salisbury earlier than expected, and Iris was already at her first fitting. The trousseau, Mrs. Wrenfield said, with a small apologetic glance at Edmund, would not wait. There were measurements to be taken, sleeves to be decided, and a question of lace that had been troubling her elder daughter for a week. Iris was very sorry, Mrs. Wrenfield assured him. Nothing would have kept her from the expedition had the matter not been so pressing. But she could not be in 2 places at once,
Of course,
Edmund said.
a first fitting must not be sacrificed to a walk on the downs.
Mrs. Wrenfield hesitated only a moment before declaring that James would go with them as far as the upper gate and remain within call. The arrangement satisfied propriety, and Edmund accepted it without comment. Charlotte came down in walking boots and a plain wool gown of moss green. She greeted him without ceremony and asked whether he had remembered his pocketbook.
I have. It is safely in my coat.
Then we shall do very well.
They went out through the side door and up the lane, James the footman following at a discreet distance with the hamper. Edmund had his collecting satchel over one shoulder, with the small vials and labels packed safely within, and the catching jar at his belt, while Charlotte carried the long-handled net. The lane opened onto a chalk track that climbed steeply between thorn hedges, and after a few minutes the hedges fell away, and they came out onto the open down. The light changed. The cut fields lay below them in tawny squares. The village a small grey cluster of roofs to the west. The beech avenue at Wrenfield Hall, a darker green line to the south. Charlotte moved easily, with the confidence of someone who had known the path since childhood. She knew where the rabbits kept their burrows, which slopes the sheep favoured at this hour, and where to step around a patch of thistle. She did not make a lesson of it. She simply walked, and Edmund walked beside her and let her lead. After half a mile they came to a thorn hedge that ran along the boundary of a stubble field. Charlotte stopped.
This hedge may be worth trying. The sheep leave the foot of it alone, and the ground stays damp beneath the thorn. If I were looking, I would begin here.
Edmund took the net from her and showed her how to hold it under the lower branches of the thorn. He gave her the stick. She tapped the upper branches as he had shown her, and a small scatter of insects came down into the net. He sorted through them with the practiced fingers of a man who had done it 10,000 times, set aside a small rove beetle, took a click beetle on his palm, and let the rest go.
You knew not to thrash at it.
He said.
I have watched my father's keeper beat hedges for partridges. The principle is not entirely different.
Edmund smiled at that. They worked the hedge for half an hour. The wind stirred softly through the thorn branches, and the morning quieted around them. The skylark fell silent at last and sank back into the grass somewhere beyond the field. Edmund took 2 more common ground beetles, named them for Charlotte as he set them in the jar, then offered her the jar so she could hold it to the light and see the green sheen on the wing cases of the second.
They are not all dark then.
No, the colour often shows only when the wing cases catch the light.
She handed the jar back, and they walked on, the wind picking up over the open down. 50 yards further along the hedge, the chalk bank fell away on their left in a small sun-warmed slope where the turf was short and the soil showed through in pale patches. Charlotte slowed, her eyes on the ground, then stopped.
Lord Ashcombe.
She did not raise her voice. She did not point. She simply waited, very still, as if one careless movement might send it away. Edmund came to her shoulder. She inclined her head, very slightly, toward a patch of chalk where the turf gave way at the foot of a small stone. There, moving with the unhurried purpose of a creature that believed itself unseen, was a ground beetle larger than any they had taken that morning. Its wing cases caught the sun in a way the others had not. The body was a deep glossy bronze. The edges of the wing cases were a clear, unmistakable violet. Edmund halted, all his attention fixed on the beetle.
Do not move,
he said quietly. He held himself perfectly still, except for the slow reach toward the jar at his belt. He stoppered the small one he had been using and took out a larger. Then he crouched and waited. The beetle paused at the foot of the stone, seemed to consider its path, and turned. Edmund's hand came down with the jar inverted, and the beetle was inside. He held the jar up and looked at it for a long moment.
Carabus nemoralis. I have not taken one of these on chalk before. I have never had so fine a specimen.
Charlotte looked at the jar, then at the slope, then down at her hands. The words slipped out before she could stop them.
Then I was of use.
Edmund laughed. He had not heard the sound from himself for weeks, and it surprised him. It was not loud or long, but it was real, and it escaped before he could prevent it. Charlotte looked up at him in mild astonishment, as a person looks who has not expected to cause laughter.
Forgive me,
he said.
but yes, you were of use. You were, in fact, the entire reason I have this beetle.
I only saw it.
Seeing it is the difficulty, catching it is the easy part.
He held up the jar again, more carefully this time, so the light caught the violet edges of the wing cases.
I shall write to Dr. McAllister in Edinburgh when I have made my notes. He will certainly want to know of it.
Then it is important.
To me it is, and to him I believe. I shall be sure to tell him who first saw it.
Charlotte's colour rose a little. She did not look at him. She looked at the slope, and at the small stone, and at the place where the turf gave way to chalk. They sat for a few minutes on the bank. Edmund set the jar carefully in his collecting satchel. Charlotte arranged the long-handled net beside her and looked out across the cut fields below them. A pair of buzzards circled the far ridge, very high. Neither of them spoke for some time.
Miss Wrenfield,
Yes.
thank you for seeing it. I should have walked straight past.
Then I'm glad I was looking down.
After a while they stood, brushed the chalk from their clothes, and walked on along the hedge for another half-mile before turning back toward the gig at the top of the lane. The hamper was waiting there, and they ate their luncheon beside the track, with the downs spread below them and the jar set safely near Edmund's satchel. The following morning, the butler brought the post in on a silver tray and set it at Mr. Wrenfield's elbow. Mr. Wrenfield sorted it without ceremony, passed 2 letters to his wife, one to Iris, and one, bearing an Edinburgh postmark, to Edmund. Edmund glanced at the hand on the cover and felt his pulse quicken. He set down his cup, broke the seal, and read. Dr. McAllister of the Edinburgh Natural History Circle wrote in his usual close hand, with his usual disregard for the margins. The first half of the letter contained news of the Society's autumn meeting and a query about a specimen of Edmund's that had been mislaid in the post. The news came in the second half. A clergyman near Marlborough, the Reverend Mr. Hatherley of a small parish whose name McAllister could not at the moment recall, had taken a specimen of Carabus monilus in the glebeland beside his vicarage in the last week of August. McAllister had seen it himself and was certain of the identification. The beetle was in Mr. Hatherley's small specimen cabinet at the vicarage, and Mr. Hatherley, McAllister wrote, was a sensible man who could be relied upon to part with a duplicate should another be found. Edmund read the letter twice. Carabus munilis, the necklace ground beetle. He had been looking for it for 4 years. It was the principal gap in the Hampshire catalogue, and one of the 2 species he most wished to add. Marlborough was perhaps 30 miles north of Wrenfield. The Reverend Mr. Hatherley had taken the specimens 6 weeks ago. He became aware, slowly, that the room had not changed. The butler was at the sideboard. Mr. Wrenfield was reading a letter from his banker. Mrs. Wrenfield watched Edmund over the rim of her teacup, missing nothing that might concern her elder daughter's prospects. Iris was opening her own letter with a small ivory paper knife.
Has the post brought you anything interesting, Lord Ashcombe?
Iris asked it brightly, as if she expected the answer to concern invitations. Edmund refolded the Edinburgh letter along its original crease and slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat.
Some news from a correspondent in Edinburgh. Nothing that should detain the breakfast table.
Oh, correspondence.
Iris smiled.
Mamma, there is a note from Carrington Place. Sophia is well enough to receive visitors. I shall call this afternoon.
Mrs. Wrenfield did not answer at once. Her eyes were still on Edmund. Then she set down her cup and said,
How good, my dear. You will give her my love.
Iris had already turned to the practical question of whether the gig could be spared, and the breakfast table returned to its usual talk. Across the table, Charlotte set down her toast. She had not opened any letter of her own. She did not look at Edmund. She picked up her cup, drank, and looked out of the long window toward the chalk downs, which were just then catching the morning sun. Edmund found himself wanting to tell her what was in the letter. The wish surprised him enough that he looked down at his plate and said nothing. After breakfast, when the others had gone, Iris to her sitting room, Mr. Wrenfield to his accounts, and Mrs. Wrenfield to the housekeeper, Edmund remained by the breakfast room window. He took the letter from his pocket and read it again. Carabus munilis, 30 miles away, found 6 weeks ago, and kept, for the moment, by a clergyman in a parish whose name even McAllister could not remember. He stood at the window for some time before he refolded the letter and put it away. This morning, he had been given the news he had wanted for 4 years. Yet as he stood by the window with the downs in the distance, the letter no longer seemed to matter only for what it contained. Not Carabus munilis, not Marlborough, not even the chance of filling the most troublesome gap in his Hampshire catalogue. What held him was the strange, unreasonable wish to show it to Charlotte before anyone else. Every morning brought him 1 day closer to marrying Iris Wrenfield. Chapter 5. Tenant. Mr. Wrenfield announced the plan over breakfast, with the satisfaction of a man who had been waiting for the right morning to do so.
Ashcombe, you must indulge me this morning. There is a small matter at the Marsden cottage, a fence between the Marsdens and the Coopers that has wanted attention since the spring, and Bryce, my steward, will be there to settle it. You shall see how we do things in Wiltshire. I should not trouble a guest with estate business, but I think this particular matter may interest you.
I should be very glad to join you.
Good man. Bryce will have the horses at the gate at 10.
Mrs. Wrenfield received the plan with visible approval. Anything that placed Lord Ashcombe beside her husband in matters of land and tenants seemed, to her, a step in the proper direction. Iris, who had not been listening, asked her mother whether the dressmaker was to come again on Thursday, and the conversation divided itself at once. At 10, Edmund came out into the gravel sweep, where Mr. Bryce was waiting with the horses. He was perhaps 50, with grey at the temples, a Scots accent, and the still, attentive posture of a man who missed little. They mounted, and Mr. Wrenfield led them down the lane at an easy walk, talking as he rode. The Marsden cottage stood half a mile beyond the village, at the foot of a slope of pasture that ran up to a thorn hedge and a stretch of ditched boundary. Old Mrs. Marsden came out to meet them at the gate, and the Coopers came over from their own door, and the morning's business began. Edmund stood back and watched. The fence was a length of post and rail at the foot of the slope, soft with rot in 2 places. The question was not whether it should be replaced, for Mr. Wrenfield had already ordered the rails, but how the small charge for its upkeep should be set down between the two holdings whose stock had been getting through it. Mr. Bryce had a notebook out and was reading from it quietly to Mr. Wrenfield, who nodded at the right moments and looked thoughtful in the proper way. The Marsdens and the Coopers stood at a respectful distance and waited to be told. Mr. Bryce proposed a division that favoured the older holding by a small margin. Mr. Wrenfield approved it. The Marsdens agreed at once. The Coopers took longer, the elder Cooper looking at his son while the son looked at his boots, but in the end they agreed also. The thing was done. Mrs. Marsden brought out a small jug of cider, which Mr. Wrenfield drank with every appearance of pleasure, and then they mounted again and rode back through the lane. Edmund had said nothing the entire time except to greet Mrs. Marsden and to thank her for the cider. He had watched the fence, the slope, and the small ditch at the foot of it, recently cleared. He had watched Mr. Bryce make a note in his book about the new rails, and Mr. Wrenfield nod over the cider with the easy assurance of a man who knew the work would be done by Michaelmas. He had been thinking, the whole time, about Ashcombe. The south meadow had not been ditched in 10 years. The boundary fencing between the home farm and the lower pasture had been rotten in places for as long as he could remember. At Ashcombe there were 8 such places, not 2. His own steward was nearly 70, had served his father for half a lifetime, and had grown too accustomed to explaining why repairs must wait another season. Mr. Wrenfield was in high good humour all the way back. At the gate of Wrenfield Hall he clapped Edmund on the shoulder.
Useful morning, eh? A man never stops learning in estate business. You will do the same at Ashcombe, and better, I dare say.
You are very kind, sir.
Not at all. Luncheon now, I think, and a quiet afternoon. Mrs. Wrenfield has been about the dinner arrangements all morning, and I dare say she will be glad of a turn in the garden.
Mr. Wrenfield went in. Edmund handed his horse to the groom, then lingered for a moment in the gravel sweep, looking up at the calm, prosperous face of Wrenfield Hall. After luncheon, the household settled into the quiet machinery of the afternoon. Iris, tired from the morning's fittings, went upstairs to rest before tea, while Mr. and Mrs. Wrenfield took a turn together in the garden. For a little while, the house was left to its own hush. Edmund found himself unwilling to sit indoors. After a morning spent watching another man's estate run smoothly, the comfort of Wrenfield Hall had begun to feel less like hospitality than a reproach. He wanted air, movement, and a little distance from it. He went out through the door at the end of the long passage. The afternoon was warm and still, with a light haze over the cut fields beyond the wall. He walked the south path without quite intending it, and at the gate of the kitchen garden he found Charlotte. She had a flat basket over her arm and a pair of scissors in her hand, and she was cutting roses from the bushes that grew along the warm south wall. She looked up when she heard the gate.
Lord Ashcombe.
Miss Wrenfield.
She did not seem surprised to see him, but she paused for a moment before returning to her cutting. She snipped a stem and laid it carefully in the basket.
Mamma will want them for the dining room tonight. The Carringtons are coming to dinner.
I had not heard.
It was only settled this morning. Sophia is well enough for a short visit. Iris is very pleased.
Edmund stood for a moment at the gate and then walked slowly down the brick path toward her. The kitchen garden was warm and quiet. A bee moved through the lavender at the foot of the wall. Beyond the paddock, the chalk downs lay pale in the haze. Charlotte snipped another rose, laid it in the basket, and looked at him.
You are very quiet, Lord Ashcombe. Was it a difficult visit?
No, the visit went very well.
I'm glad to hear it.
She returned to the roses. He stood for a moment looking at the paddock wall, where she had first shown him the place beneath the stones. Her silence asked nothing of him, and somehow that made it easier to speak.
It went well for the Marsdens, who will have a sound fence by Michaelmas, and for the Coopers, who will pay no more than their fair share. It went well for your father, who has a competent steward, a comfortable estate, and the means to mend a fence before the rot has time to spread.
Charlotte said nothing. She snipped another rose, more slowly than the last.
At Ashcombe, the south meadow has not been ditched in 10 years. The boundary fencing between the home farm and the lower pasture has been rotten in 8 places for as long as I can remember. There is no Mr. Bryce at Ashcombe. My steward is old, and was my father's man, and is not the man for what the estate now needs. The Marsdens and the Coopers, if they were my tenants, would be waiting on a fence that I cannot afford to mend without taking the money from somewhere else that also needs it.
He stopped. He had not meant to say so much. He had not meant to say any of it. Charlotte did not look at him. She laid the rose in the basket. She closed the scissors and held them at her side.
Is there a steward you could trust, Lord Ashcombe, if you had the means to employ him?
It was a practical question, asked without softness and without pity. Edmund considered it for a moment, surprised by it, and then he answered her.
There is a man in the next county whose work I have watched for some time. He is young, but he has been under steward on a well-run estate for 6 years, and I have heard nothing but good of him. I have not approached him before now because I had nothing certain to offer.
And after the wedding?
After the wedding, I shall be in a better position.
Charlotte snipped another rose. The bee moved out of the lavender and into the rosemary along the path. From the direction of the house came the sound of a door opening onto the gravel, followed by light footsteps approaching the garden wall.
My mother is coming,
Charlotte said quietly.
She will have seen us from the house.
Mrs. Wrenfield came round the corner of the kitchen garden a moment later with her bonnet on and a small pair of garden gloves in her hand, smiling as though she had come out for nothing more than the air.
Lord Ashcombe, you have found my younger daughter helping with the flowers. She is the only one of us who can be relied upon to cut roses that are not too short in the stem.
Miss Charlotte was explaining why this wall suits the roses so well.
The sun rests here longer than anywhere else. It has always been the best wall for roses. Charlotte, we shall want at least a dozen more. Lord Ashcombe, will you walk back to the house with me? I should like your opinion on the seating for this evening.
She held out her arm. Edmund offered his. They walked back through the gate, and Charlotte was left alone in the kitchen garden, her basket full of roses and the scissors still in her hand. For a moment she stood very still, thinking of Ashcombe, and of a man who had spoken as if the words had escaped him before he could call them back. Iris came down to dinner, in deep blue silk, with a single white camellia at her shoulder, and before long she held the attention of the whole table. The Carringtons were there. Mr. Carrington, very thin and very mild, with the air of a gentleman who had spent 20 years being gently overruled. Mrs. Carrington, comfortably portly and full of anxious care, and Sophia, plump, pretty and lively, with no appearance of lingering illness beyond the shawl her mother kept urging her to keep about her shoulders. Mr. Wrenfield was in high spirits from the first course, and before the soup had been removed he had begun telling the Carringtons about the Marsden fence.
Bryce settled it beautifully.
He said, reaching for his glass.
A little rot in the lower rail, stock getting through from both sides, and both families convinced the other ought to bear more of the charge. But we had the matter settled fairly enough by noon, Ashcombe?
Very fairly,
Edmund said.
Papa, you know I cannot bear estate business at dinner. It always ends with someone saying a ditch has been cleared or a fence has been fairly settled,
Iris said, with a laughing look across the table. Mr. Wrenfield laughed, entirely unoffended.
There, you see? My daughter has no taste for the serious business of the country.
I have a great taste for the country,
Iris said.
only not for its accounts, fences or ditches.
Then, with perfect ease, she turned to Mrs. Carrington.
But we must not let Papa keep us among ditches all evening. I have heard the most extraordinary story about a hat, and I cannot possibly keep it to myself.
The story had reached Iris earlier in the week from Lady Markham's youngest daughter, and she told it now with the bright satisfaction of a woman who knew she had the table's full attention and meant to keep it. The young lady had lately attended a garden party in Hampshire, not far from Ashcombe Park, where the hostess had worn a hat adorned with 2 entire birds, several loops of ribbon, artificial cherries, and trembling sprays of silk leaves. One bird faced east, the other west, as though the arrangement had been settled after a quarrel. The story unfolded in Iris's clear voice through 5 or 6 small turns. each one funnier than the last, with named characters from 3 counties and a closing image of a guest's spaniel planting itself before the hostess and barking at the birds upon her hat, until the poor lady was obliged to retreat indoors. The table gave her exactly the laughter she expected. Mrs. Carrington smiled until her anxious face softened. Sophia laughed aloud from behind the shawl she plainly did not need, and Mr. Wrenfield wiped his eyes. Edmund laughed where courtesy required it. He had been watching Iris for some time. She was very beautiful tonight. The deep blue suited her colouring, and the single camellia at her shoulder was placed with the unfailing care of a woman who had long understood the value of being looked at. Her voice carried the story easily from one turn to the next. Her eyes brightened at the right places. She was wholly in her element, and the room belonged to her. Edmund watched her and waited for admiration to become something warmer. He could find nothing to fault. Iris was beautiful, witty, and soon to be his wife. She had every grace a man might reasonably be expected to admire. Yet admiration remained admiration. It did not quicken into tenderness, or trust, or the strange ease he had felt that afternoon when Charlotte had listened to the troubles at Ashcombe and asked how they might be mended. That was the thought he could not dismiss. Charlotte, seated halfway down the table, made no effort to draw attention from her sister. She was used to rooms turning toward Iris, and appeared neither surprised nor wounded by it. She wore pale green muslin tonight, with no ornament beyond a narrow ribbon at her throat. Candlelight did not make her shine as it did Iris. It softened her, finding the warm lights in her brown hair, the natural rose in her cheeks, and the faint summer freckles across her nose. She did not look at Edmund. Then, a moment later, she did. The look was brief, not quite a signal, but it carried the memory of the kitchen garden between them. Later, in his own room, Edmund stood at the open window. The candles were lit on the writing table behind him, and his reflection showed faintly in the dark glass. He thought, for a long time, about the South Meadow, about rotten fences, uncleared ditches, and money wanted in every direction at once. His marriage was meant to save Ashcombe. And every day that truth sat more heavily beside what he was beginning to feel for Charlotte. Chapter 6. The Ball. The autumn ball at Stanton Court was the great event of the Wiltshire season, and at Wrenfield Hall the household had been in motion since dawn. The afternoon's principal undertaking was the dressing of Iris Wrenfield. The maid had been at her since 3, and Mrs. Wrenfield had been in and out of the dressing room with the brisk assurance of a general overseeing a campaign she had been planning for months. At 7, Iris was ready. Half an hour later, she came down the great staircase. Mrs. Wrenfield was waiting in the hall. Mr. Wrenfield stood by the long case clock, and Edmund remained a step behind him. At the door, the butler stood ready. Beyond him, 2 footmen waited by the carriage. All of them looked up as she descended. She wore peacock green silk, the bodice embroidered with a delicate pattern of small flowers in seed pearl, the short puffed sleeves trimmed with cream lace, and a darker sash tied beneath the bust. A single strand of pearls lay at her throat, and her fair hair, dressed high, was ornamented only with pearl pins. The whole effect was rich, elegant, and perfectly judged, with the sure hand of a woman who had dressed for admiration since she was 16. The candlelight caught the silk as she moved, deepening it almost to bottle green in shadow, then brightening it to peacock and teal as she turned at the foot of the stairs.
My dear Iris,
Mrs. Wrenfield said, with the particular softness of a mother seeing her daughter become exactly what she had intended. Mr. Wrenfield offered Iris his arm.
You will do us proud tonight, my girl.
I hope so, Papa.
Edmund bowed over her hand.
Miss Wrenfield, you look very beautiful tonight.
You are very kind, Lord Ashcombe.
The phrase was perfectly placed. She offered it with the ease of a woman who had been receiving such remarks for 4 seasons and had never once let one of them quicken her pulse. Charlotte came down a few minutes later. She wore pale buttermilk silk, modestly cut, with short puffed sleeves, a square neckline edged with fine lace, and a narrow cream ribbon at the waist. A small gold cross hung at her throat. Her hair was dressed high in soft coils, with dark ringlets arranged at her temples and a few curls falling against her neck. He had never seen it arranged so finely, though she wore no pearls, flowers, or ornament.
Miss Charlotte,
Edmund said, bowing to her.
you look very well this evening.
Thank you, Lord Ashcombe.
It was a small compliment, properly given, and she received it as such. But the colour that rose in her face did not belong to mere politeness. Mrs. Wrenfield looked her over and said,
Yes, my dear, that will do very well.
Charlotte accepted the verdict without comment. The carriages were brought round, and the Wrenfield party set out for Stanton Court. Stanton Court was lit from gate to portico when they arrived, and the long drive was full of carriages. Lady Merton received the Wrenfields and Lord Ashcombe at the head of the ballroom, a tall, handsome woman of 60, for whom the autumn ball was an annual pleasure. Mrs. Wrenfield was greeted with warmth, Mr. Wrenfield with cordial respect, and Charlotte with a kindness that was genuine, if brief. Edmund was welcomed as a future connection of the family. Iris, however, was kissed on the cheek and admired, with no pretense of formality, before being sent smiling into the room. Once there, she seemed to belong to it at once. Edmund stood at her shoulder for the first quarter hour and watched the history of her 4 seasons gathering around her. Mr. Templeton was dancing this evening with another young woman, though his eyes strayed once too often toward Iris for perfect unconcern. Sir William Hartley, twice Iris's age and married now, greeted her with grave courtesy. Mrs. Wrenfield murmured to Edmund in passing that he had been one of her admirers in her first season. A younger man, whose name Edmund did not catch, flushed slightly when Iris turned to him, then recovered with the practiced smile of a man who had been doing so for 2 years. Iris greeted them all with perfect ease, old admirers, disappointed hopes, and gentlemen who had once imagined themselves favoured gathered round her without troubling her composure. Their engagement had been a long one, and the wedding was near enough that she moved through the ball less as a young woman still to be courted than as one already received into her future life. In the early dances, she looked calm, handsome, and entirely at home. Edmund opened the ball with her. The first dance was theirs by right, and they performed it with proper grace. Iris moved prettily through the figures. Edmund was correct, attentive, and perfectly composed. They exchanged a few easy remarks, none of which seemed to touch either of them very deeply. When the set ended, he returned her to her mother, and within 5 minutes she had been claimed by Mr. Templeton for the next. Edmund watched her dance with Mr. Templeton, who was graceful, composed, and far too practised in her company. They moved through the figures with the ease of 2 people who had stood opposite one another at half a dozen balls and had once understood the possibility of more. Neither betrayed it. Iris laughed once at something he said. He looked away, and the dance went on. The supper interval came at 10:30. Edmund handed Iris in, found her a place beside Sophia Carrington, and waited until she had a glass of negus in her hand and had taken her supper. Then he said, in a quieter voice than he had used all evening,
Miss Wrenfield, would you walk with me a moment in the gallery? It is cooler there, and I've hardly had you to myself this evening.
Iris was a little surprised. For an instant her glance went back to Sophia Carrington and the lively conversation she was leaving behind. Then she smiled, set down her glass, and rose with the graceful readiness expected of a young woman whose fiancé had asked for a private word. The long gallery at Stanton Court ran the length of the south front and was hung with 2 centuries of Merton portraits. A few candles burned at intervals along the wall, but the rest of the gallery lay in soft half-darkness, and the sound of the ballroom dropped away as they entered it. Their footsteps were loud on the polished floor. Edmund led her halfway down the gallery and stopped beside the portrait of a young woman in powdered hair and pale satin, a Merton bride, by the painted date, of the summer of 1769.
I have been wanting to speak with you properly. The visit has been busy, and you and I have hardly had an hour to ourselves.
It has been very busy. The trousseau alone has occupied half my mornings.
I had wanted to ask you, Iris, what you most look forward to in our married life.
She considered the question for a moment, her expression still softly pleased.
The house we are to have in town, I confess. Mamma and I have spoken of it for 2 years, and I shall be very glad to be settled there for the season. I look forward to receiving my own friends in my own rooms at last. One never quite belongs to oneself in one's mother's house.
And Ashcombe Park?
Ashcombe Park will be very pleasant, I am sure. Mamma says the country round Hampshire is gentler than ours. I shall like that, I think, though I hope we shall spend a good part of the year in town.
You have never wished to see it before the wedding.
There was no proper occasion. Besides, Mamma and I agreed it would be prettier to see it first as its mistress.
Of course.
She smiled.
Mamma wondered whether the dower house is quite large enough. It sounded rather small.
For whom?
For guests, perhaps, or for anyone we might wish to have near us, without having them quite in the house.
I see.
He looked at her in the soft half-light. She was perfectly composed. She was simply showing him, with perfect candour, what their marriage had always meant to her.
Iris, may I ask something a little forward?
You may ask me anything, Lord Ashcombe.
Why did you choose this match? You had other offers, I know. Were there particular reasons you preferred mine?
She was not embarrassed. She did not lower her eyes. She took the question as the small, frank compliment between two people about to marry that he had perhaps meant it to be.
I had 3 offers in my first 2 seasons. Mr. Halford of Bristol would have given me a very fine house in town, but no title to go with it. Lord Stockbridge had a title, but his estate was smaller than yours, and his mother would have made my life a misery. Mr. Carruthers had nothing in particular to offer and asked me anyway.
You knew exactly what you wanted.
I refused them all because I was waiting for the right arrangement. A title, an estate, the proper kind of life. When Papa came home from London with the agreement settled, I was very glad. The terms were good. The waiting had been worth it.
You had not met me.
No, but Papa had, and Papa is sensible in such matters. The shape of the thing was right. The rest, I thought, would arrange itself.
She said it without embarrassment, and with no suspicion that there was anything in it to wound him. She had not chosen Edmund. She had chosen the life attached to him, and thought the distinction too small to matter. Edmund was quiet for a moment. The candle nearest them guttered, and the face in the portrait seemed to waver in the dimness.
Thank you for telling me.
Of course.
He offered her his arm. They walked back through the gallery in silence. To Iris it seemed companionable enough. She returned to her place beside Sophia Carrington, and within a minute she was laughing at something Sophia had said. Edmund stood for a moment at the doorway of the supper room, watching her. Then he crossed the floor to where Charlotte was standing near her mother, and asked her to dance. The dance was a country dance, too lively for discussion, and they took their places in the line. They did not say much. Once, in passing down the figure, their hands touched for the small required moment. Edmund felt the warmth of her hand through his glove, and long after they had parted, he could still feel it there. The dance ended. Edmund returned her to Mrs. Wrenfield, bowed, and did not ask her again. At 2 o'clock, the carriage was brought to the door. Iris was tired, happy and entirely satisfied with the evening. She climbed in, settled herself against the cushions, and was asleep before the carriage had cleared the Stanton gates. Mr. Wrenfield in the corner had begun to doze before her. Mrs. Wrenfield was in the carriage behind them with the Carringtons. Charlotte and Edmund sat opposite one another in the close darkness, while the carriage lamps sent wavering yellow light along the lanes. They did not speak. Iris slept on in the corner, her head turned against the cushion, the miles passing in silence. Charlotte's hand rested on the seat between them. Once, when the carriage jolted, it shifted a little nearer his. Edmund saw it and did not move. The miles went by. When the carriage drew up at Wrenfield Hall, Iris was helped down by a footman, and Mr. Wrenfield was guided in by another, and Charlotte and Edmund descended last. In the candle-lit hall, they exchanged quiet goodnights before going up to their rooms. That night, Charlotte Wrenfield sat at her small writing desk with a single candle burning beside her. She opened her leather-bound book, dipped her pen, and held her hand above the page for a very long time. Then she wrote, in her clear, careful hand,
I shall remember the dance for as long as I dare.
She closed the book, placed it in the drawer, and blew out the candle. Chapter 7. Storm. The walk had been Iris's idea, though by morning she had found herself unequal to it. Mrs. Wrenfield brought the news to the breakfast table with practised ease. Iris had wakened with a headache from the previous evening's dancing and would keep to her room. The walk, however, need not be abandoned. The morning was close and bright. The hamper had already been packed, and James would go with them to the upper gate, where the gig was to wait.
You will keep to the upper path,
Mrs. Wrenfield said. Her smile was mild, but her eyes moved from Charlotte to Edmund.
James shall remain with the gig, and you will be back by 3.
Of course, Mamma,
Charlotte said. Charlotte and Edmund set out at 11, James following with the hamper. The morning was warm and unnaturally still, the chalk almost white beneath a wide, pale sky. At the upper gate, James gave the hamper into Edmund's keeping and remained there with the horse, as he had been instructed. From that point, the upper path ran open along the down, visible for some distance from the lane. For a while the house remained visible below them. Then the hedge drew them on toward the spinney, where Charlotte had found the Carabus nemoralis. Edmund took 2 new ground beetles, neither remarkable. Then Charlotte, carrying the net, stopped and looked up.
is the wind changing?
Edmund straightened. The air had gone suddenly still, and the light had altered. To the southwest, a dark mass of cloud was moving over the ridge, low and fast. A moment later, thunder sounded, and a grey sheet of rain appeared beyond the slope, sweeping towards them across the downs.
We should turn back.
We should, but the keeper's hut is just beyond the spinney. We shall reach it sooner than the gig.
Then we go there.
They set off at once. The first drops struck before they reached the stile, large and widely spaced, darkening the chalk where they fell. Then the wind came hard across the downs, flattening the grass and driving the rain slantwise against them. By the time they reached the spinney, Charlotte's gown was clinging at the hem, Edmund's hair was wet at the temples, and the keeper's hut was no longer merely convenient. It was the only shelter near enough. Edmund pushed the door open against the wind, and they stepped inside. The hut was low, dry and dim, with a small unglazed window, a cold hearth, a bench, a wooden chair, and shelves holding coiled nets, a pair of boots, and a tin lantern. The keeper had been there recently. Kindling lay ready in the grate. Edmund found flint and steel on the mantel, and within a few minutes a small fire had begun to take. The rain was loud on the wooden roof. Edmund set the hamper on the bench, and Charlotte went to the window. The storm had moved over the downs more quickly than either of them had expected. The chalk slope they had climbed was already half lost in grey. Her cloak was wet at the hem, and his coat was dark across the shoulders. He shrugged it off, laid it over the back of the chair, and turned his attention to the kindling in the hearth.
It will be an hour at least before the rain passes.
I think so.
Edmund unpacked the cold luncheon. Bread, cheese, sliced ham, a small jar of pickles, a folded napkin of plum cake, and a bottle of lemonade. Charlotte thanked him when he passed her a plate, and they ate with the careful politeness of 2 people trying not to notice how very alone they were. When the meal was done, Charlotte folded her hands in her lap and looked at them for a moment. A crack of lightning split the air just beyond the hut. The white flash filled the little room, and the thunder followed at once, so hard and close that the tin lantern rattled on the shelf. Charlotte drew a breath. Edmund looked at her.
Are you frightened?
Not of the storm.
He did not answer. After a moment she said,
Then we shall talk, if you will.
Yes, we shall.
They began with small subjects: the keeper's hut, the hedge they had been working, and whether Edmund had identified the second of the 2 ground beetles or whether it needed further examination. The conversation moved by small degrees, while the storm battered the roof and a strange grey light held at the window. After a while she asked him about Ashcombe Park, how the house looked from the drive, whether the rooms were old or much altered, which windows caught the morning sun, and whether he had lived there as a child. He answered her. He had not described the house to anyone in several years, yet the words came more readily than he had expected. She asked which room had been his mother's favourite. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that his mother had loved the south drawing-room best. She had been slight, observant, and careful in all she did. When he was a boy, and already wild for beetles, moths, and every small creeping thing the garden could produce, she had bought him his first book of insects. It had been too advanced for him at 7, but she had read it with him all the same, sounding out the Latin names until he could say them better than she could. When he brought her his captures, she had never flinched. She had held them gently in the curve of her hand so that he could see the legs move, and had asked him what he thought they were. His first book of insects was still at Ashcombe Park, in the desk in that room.
You loved her.
Very much.
I'm glad she gave you that.
So am I.
Charlotte looked at him. The rain had eased a little, and then strengthened again.
I have wished to ask about your father, but I think I should not.
You may ask.
Then only one thing. Did you love him as well?
Not as I love my mother.
He said it without bitterness, as though it were only a fact long settled. Charlotte let the words stand. After a while she told him about her own childhood at Wrenfield, how she had been the quiet one in the schoolroom while Iris was already the one visitors asked to see. She had taken her education from the governess and her interests from the library, where no one thought to look for her. She had read the county natural history, learned the kitchen garden by heart, and walked on the downs because no one had told her not to. Her father joked that Charlotte knew every cabbage at Wrenfield, and perhaps she did, but she knew the herbs too, the fruit trees, and which corner of the wall held the warmth longest after sunset. She had been, she said, a perfectly happy child, or near enough to happy that no one had thought to ask. Then she said, looking down at her hands,
I should like to ask you something I have no right to ask.
If it is you who asks, I will answer.
If your marriage had come about by any other means, if no one had arranged it, if you had been free, would this have been the life you chose?
He did not answer immediately. The rain had grown loud again. He looked at the floor between them, then at her hands in her lap, then at the small, unglazed window where the grey light had just begun to brighten.
No.
Charlotte closed her eyes for a moment.
I am sorry I asked.
I am not. No one else ever has.
There was a long silence in which neither of them moved. Then Charlotte said, very low,
What shall I do, Lord Ashcombe, when you are married to my sister?
He looked at her then. For a moment he seemed to search for an answer.
I do not know.
She nodded once, as if she had expected nothing else.
I have been thinking about it. I have come to no answer.
Nor have I.
The rain eased, then thickened, then eased again. They sat. After a long time, the light through the window brightened, and Edmund stood and looked out. The cloud was breaking up to the west. The slope down to Wrenfield was visible again, grey-green beneath the heavy sky.
It is passing.
Then we must go back.
Yes.
And be as we were.
Can you?
No, but I can behave as if I can.
So can I.
Then that must do.
They gathered the hamper and the net. Edmund put on his coat, still damp from where it had lain over the chair. Charlotte drew her wet cloak about her shoulders and tied her bonnet ribbons under her chin. At the door she stopped, one hand on the latch, and did not turn round.
Lord Ashcombe.
Yes?
For a moment she said nothing. Then, very quietly, she said,
Nothing. Forgive me.
She opened the door, and they stepped out into the wet world. The rain had slackened to a fine mist by the time they reached the upper gate. James was waiting there with the gig, looking damp, anxious, and deeply relieved to see them. He took the hamper from Edmund without comment, helped Charlotte up, and drove them down toward Wrenfield Hall, while the wheels hissed softly through the wet chalk. They reached the house at 3:30, their shoes and hems sodden, Charlotte's bonnet clinging to her hair, and Edmund's coat dark with rain. In the hall, towels had already been brought, and Mrs. Wrenfield was waiting with the composed relief of a mother who had been concerned, but not yet alarmed, since the storm explained their delay. Iris was in the morning room. She rose when she saw them, put a hand to her mouth, and laughed before she could prevent it.
Oh, Charlotte, you look like a wet hen.
A ripple of laughter went through the hall. Mr. Wrenfield laughed too, and Mrs. Wrenfield laughed with the relief of a mother whose daughter had returned safely. Edmund did not laugh. Charlotte laughed. She had been laughing at her sister's small jokes since she was 4, and the habit rose before she could stop it. She stood in the wet hall with her bonnet ribbons untied and her hair plastered to her face, and said,
I am sure I do, Iris. I shall go up at once and become a dry hen instead.
She went up the stairs without looking back. Edmund went up to his own room to change. He came down to dinner at the usual hour, in dry clothes, and Charlotte did not appear. Mrs. Wrenfield said Charlotte had taken a chill and would keep to her room until morning. Edmund said nothing. He did not believe for a moment that her absence had anything to do with the rain. Iris was sympathetic in the general way she had, kindly enough in tone, but not much troubled in feeling. Mr. Wrenfield asked whether they had found anything of interest. Edmund said they had taken 2 new specimens. The dinner went on. The next morning the storm had passed entirely, and sunlight entered the morning room with innocent brightness. Edmund came down early, opened his notebook by the long window, and tried to draw. He did not succeed for long. A message came from Mr. Wrenfield, asking whether Lord Ashcombe would come out to the stables and give his opinion on a new horse. Edmund closed the book, set it beside the inkstand, and left the room. A few minutes later Charlotte came in. She had meant only to return a volume to the shelf, but the notebook lay on the small table by the window, familiar in its worn brown cover. She should not have touched it. She knew that, and touched it all the same. At first there were only the things she had seen before: beetles, grasses, small notes on soil and weather, the half-finished Carabus Nemoralis with its violet edges still unfinished. Near the back, she found a page she had not seen. It was not a beetle, or a grass blade, or a note on soil. It was the beginning of a face, the line of a cheek, the curve of a mouth not quite smiling, the dark sweep of hair at the temple. It was unfinished, but she knew herself at once. Below it, in the corner of the page, he had drawn one hand as well, with a small ink mark near the forefinger, rendered with the same exact care he gave to wing cases and legs, and all the small living things he understood so well. Charlotte looked at it for a long time. She heard his step in the passage and closed the notebook at once. When Edmund entered, she was standing by the table with one hand resting on the cover. Neither of them spoke. Edmund's eyes went to the notebook, then to her. Whatever colour the morning had given him left his face. Her own face held no triumph, no accusation, only a kind of wonder, so painful and so tender that he could not look at it for long. Charlotte moved her hand away from the notebook. For a moment neither of them moved. Then Charlotte turned and left the room without looking back. Edmund remained by the table, the notebook closed within his hand. The square of sunlight shifted along the rug. He did not open it again. He sat in the morning room for a long time, and the house was still. Chapter 8. Orchard. In the days after the storm, Charlotte Wrenfield quietly began to keep away from the rooms where Edmund was likely to be. The library was left to him. The south corridor, with the small sitting room where he kept his collecting case and notes, became a place she passed only when necessary. It was done so gradually that for the first day or two it might have been chance. She was at breakfast, but she sat beside her mother and spoke only when spoken to. She came to luncheon, but her answers were so calm and brief that no one could have called them rude, and no one could have mistaken them for conversation. In the drawing room before dinner, she took up her work beside the lamp and kept her eyes on the needle in her hand. Edmund noticed. He could not help it. He was a man who logged things. Dates, locations, conditions. Without meaning to, he began noting the small changes in Charlotte with the same exactness he gave to his specimens. The lowered eyes at breakfast, the brief answer at luncheon, the calm, blank expression she wore whenever someone spoke of Lord Ashcombe. By the fourth day he understood that this was not coldness but control, and that he was meant to understand it but not to remark upon it. He also understood by the fourth day that Charlotte was not the only one arranging matters. Mrs. Wrenfield had grown attentive in a particular way. If Edmund entered a room where Charlotte was sitting, the conversation shifted, the seating altered, or some small domestic necessity required Charlotte elsewhere. None of it had the appearance of unkindness, and none of it was obvious enough to be challenged. It was only that Charlotte was never quite left where Edmund might speak with her alone, and Mrs. Wrenfield arranged it all with a smooth unconcern that was itself the most eloquent thing about it. Once, passing the morning-room door, Edmund heard Mrs. Wrenfield say, in her pleasant everyday voice,
"Charlotte, my dear, Mrs. Hale has asked particularly after you. You might walk down this afternoon. The air will do you good after so much time indoors."
Charlotte answered in the same pleasant tone.
Of course, Mamma, I should be glad to.
Edmund went back to his own room and stood at the window for a while. There was no entry to make for this. Charlotte was being kept busy, he was being kept apart from her, and Mrs. Wrenfield was arranging it all with such pleasant exactness that no one could have called it unkind. Iris, meanwhile, was happier than Edmund had seen her since he came to Wrenfield. The morning room had been given over entirely to the wedding. The dressmaker had come out from Salisbury with an assistant and a great quantity of boxes, and for 3 days the long table had been covered with fabric, and every chair had held some parcel of muslin, silk, lace or ribbon. There were packets of seed pearls, and ribbons sorted by colour along the window seat. Iris moved through it all with a list in her hand and the absorbed pleasure of a woman seeing a long-imagined day take shape around her. She was generous in her happiness. When Edmund came to the door on the second morning, she called him in at once and showed him a length of lace held up to the light.
It came yesterday from London. Is it not the finest you ever saw? Mamma thought the other pattern, but I held out for this one. One must be firm about the things that matter.
It is very fine.
It is for the sleeves. The gown itself is nearly done.
She nodded toward the far end of the table, where a length of ivory silk lay folded under a sheet of muslin, protected from the dust, with only one edge showing.
You are not to look at it. It is very bad luck. But it is nearly done, and it is exactly what I wanted, and I have wanted it for a very long time.
She said it with perfect sincerity, and with no apparent sense that Edmund might have wished to matter in her happiness as much as the gown, the lace, or the day itself. She was happy. The happiness was real. It had very little to do with him, and might have looked much the same had any other suitable man stood in his place. None of that made it less complete.
I am glad it is what you wanted.
It is. Now you must go, for the dressmaker is waiting for me, and the Ma will say it is very bad luck for you to remain.
She was already turning back to the table, the list in her hand, entirely content. Edmund went. At the door he looked back once. Iris had already turned to the dressmaker, holding the lace against her sleeve.
It must not be too plain. Lady Ashcombe cannot have dull sleeves.
The dressmaker murmured something obliging. Iris laughed softly,
Lady Ashcombe.
as if trying the name in the air.
I do think it has a very pretty sound.
Edmund stood a moment longer in the doorway. Iris was in the middle of the bright room with the lace and the ribbons and the folded ivory, the very picture of a young woman about to receive something she had wanted for a long time. Her happiness did not seem to fasten itself very closely to him, and yet it was real, bound up in the gown, the lace, and the name she had just tried aloud. He understood then that any change in his own heart would take something real from Iris. He found her in the walled orchard on the 5th afternoon, not entirely by accident. Mrs. Wrenfield had gone to the village herself, for once. Iris was at a final fitting. Mr. Wrenfield was with his steward. For 1 hour, those who usually kept watch over the house were all elsewhere. Edmund had been hoping for such an hour for several days, though he had not admitted it even to himself. He walked out into the gardens and found Charlotte gathering windfall apples into a flat basket beneath the oldest tree. She heard the gate and looked up. In the moment before either of them spoke, he saw her understand that they were alone, and that for once there was no careful hand to separate them. He came down the path toward her. She did not move. She held the basket against her side and watched him with the careful stillness he had learned to recognize.
I have been trying to speak with you,
I know.
and you have been determined that I should not.
Yes,
Then you know why I'm here.
I know why you think you are here.
Charlotte.
No,
She said it quietly, but it stopped him as completely as a hand on his chest.
you must not say it. If you say it, it becomes real. Then one of us must act upon it. I have thought a great deal about what that would mean. I do not think you have thought about it as long as I have.
Then tell me what you have decided.
She set the basket down on the low orchard wall and did not look away from him. When she spoke, it was without heat, in the careful, level voice of someone laying out an account she had gone over many times in private.
If you do not marry Iris, the engagement is broken less than a week before the wedding. My sister has done nothing wrong. She is happier this week than I have ever seen her. She would be humiliated before the whole county. My father, who arranged this in good faith, would be exposed to every kind of comment. And Mamma, who bears every anxiety of this family as if it were her own particular failing, would suffer for it.
She drew a breath but did not look away.
And then there is Ashcombe, Lord Ashcombe, the South Meadow, the rotten fences, the tenants waiting on repairs you cannot make. Without Iris's portion, your estate does not get the steward it needs. The people who depend on you must go on as they are, because the money that would have set those things right comes with the marriage. If there is no marriage, there is no portion.
I do not care about the portion.
You care about the tenants. You told me so yourself.
He had no answer to that. She went on, more gently.
And there is one more thing, because you should hear all of it. If you broke with Iris, you could not marry me. Not for years, if ever. A man does not jilt the elder sister less than a week before the wedding and then marry the younger. We should both of us be ruined, and the family with us. All we should have gained would be the right to say aloud what we already know.
She looked at him steadily.
I am not willing to pay that price, Lord Ashcombe. Not for myself, and not for you. It is too high, and those who would bear the worst of it have done nothing to deserve it.
The orchard was very quiet. A wasp moved over a split apple in the grass. Somewhere beyond the wall, a dog barked twice and stopped.
So you must marry her, and you must be kind to her. Iris will not understand what has passed between us, and it would be cruel to let her suspect it. You must not speak to me again, as you were about to speak to me just now. Not today, not at the wedding, not after. If you are ever to be my brother, you must be nothing more than that. I cannot say this twice. I have barely managed to say it once.
She picked up the basket again. Her hands were steady, though he saw the effort beneath the steadiness. He said nothing. She had asked enough of herself already.
Charlotte, you are asking me to marry her, knowing what I know now.
I am asking you to choose what will do the least harm. It happens to be the hardest thing as well. I am sorry for that, more sorry than I can tell you. Now I am going in, and you will stay here until I have gone. Tomorrow we shall both be quite ordinary. We are very good at being ordinary, Lord Ashcombe. We have had practice.
She walked past him up the path, not quickly, and without looking back. The gate closed behind her, and Edmund stood in the walled orchard among the fallen apples and the long afternoon shadows, with the words still locked inside him. That night Charlotte Wrenfield sat at her small writing desk, with a single candle burning beside her. She opened her leather-bound book, dipped her pen, and held her hand above the page, longer than she ever had before. Then she wrote, in her clear, careful hand,
I sent him back to her today. I believe it was right. I do not yet know how I am to live beside the right thing, now that I have done it.
She closed the book, placed it in the drawer, and blew out the candle. Chapter 9. Beetle. Edmund did not undress that night. He sat down at the small writing table in his room. The leather folder of estate papers lay before him, unopened since he had brought it from Hampshire 3 weeks earlier. Now, for the first time since his father died, he began to work through the accounts of Ashcombe Park as they actually were, not as he had wished them to be. He had brought the papers because there were still particulars of the marriage settlement to be reviewed before the final signatures. A man about to marry ought to know precisely what he was bringing into the bargain. He had not looked at them. Now he laid them out across the table: the mortgage deed, the rent roll, the steward's quarterly accounts, and the long list of repairs deferred. The picture was bad, but it was not a mystery. His father had borrowed against the estate 11 years ago. The interest had been eating the rents ever since, while the deferred repairs had quietly become more expensive with every year they were left undone. Once the settlements were signed, the marriage portion would have cleared the mortgage at a stroke. That had always been the bargain his father had made. With the mortgage gone, the rents would have been his own again. Repairs could be made, the new steward properly paid, and the whole estate brought back into order within 2 years. It was a good arrangement, and Charlotte had been right to say that without the portion the easy way was closed. But the easy way was not the only way. He worked through the night. The candles sank lower, sheets were filled, crossed through, and filled again. More than once he rose from the table and stood at the window, only to return to the columns. The figures were not kind, but they were exact. If he gave up the plan of a London house, which Iris wanted and he did not, 1,000 a year would stay at Ashcombe. If he sold the outlying land at Nethercote, bought by his father for sentiment and never profitable, he could clear 1/3 of the mortgage outright. And if he closed the 2 unused wings of the house, reduced the stable, and lived according to his actual means rather than his expected ones, he could meet the interest on what remained of the mortgage. He could pay the new steward. Slowly, over perhaps 6 or 7 years rather than 2, he could mend the fences, ditch the meadow, and do right by the tenants who had waited too long. It would be a smaller life. No townhouse, no season, no fashionable carriage and horses kept for show, no entertaining beyond what a country gentleman could decently manage. It would be harder than the life the marriage would have bought, and slower, and it would ask of him a discipline he had not yet had to learn. By the time the candles had burned down and the first grey light showed at the window, he had it on paper. It would not be comfortable, but it would be possible. In the cold early light, the figures made plain what he had not understood until now. The marriage portion would have saved a particular idea of Ashcombe. The grand one, the easy one, the one with a townhouse and a season in London. But the estate itself, the land, the tenants, the South Meadow, could still be saved by other means. Harder means, his own means. He had been telling himself that he had no choice. He saw now that he had simply not done the arithmetic. He could not stay in his room. He put on his coat, took up his collecting case, almost without thinking, and let himself out of the sleeping house and into the cold, early morning. The dew was heavy and the sky was clearing. He walked without choosing a direction, first along the lane, then onto the sheep track, until he came to the thorn hedge at the boundary of the stubble field, the hedge where Charlotte had found the Carabus nemoralis. He had not meant to come here. He stood at the hedge in the wet grey light and remembered her stopping, very still, with her eyes on the ground, and saying his name without raising her voice.
Lord Ashcombe.
He remembered the violet edge of the wing cases and her quiet words.
Then I was of use.
If he went through with the wedding, he would have no right to linger over any of it. In the orchard she had refused to let him speak of it. And then, because he was a man who turned over stones, he crouched at the foot of the hedge. The bank fell away there into a small bare slope where the chalk showed through. He turned over a flat stone, as he had done 10,000 times before, expecting nothing. Beneath it, in the dark, damp shelter of the stone, a large beetle sat motionless. Edmund went very still. It was large, larger than the nemoralis, broad and heavy-bodied, and its wing cases were not smooth. Along each one ran rows of fine raised ridges, and between the ridges lay chains of small linked pits, bead upon bead upon bead, like a string of dark jewels laid down the length of its back. The whole creature had a dull bronze sheen in the grey light, deepening almost to black in the shadow of the stone. He knew it at once. He had studied it in drawings for 4 years. Carabus manellus, the necklace ground beetle, the missing piece in his Hampshire collection, the species he had hunted across 4 counties and 4 years and never once taken. The beetle that Dr. McAllister had written of from Edinburgh, found by a clergyman 30 miles north. Edmund had once thought of riding out to see it for himself, but had never gone. It was here, under a stone at the foot of Charlotte's hedge, on the morning he had finally understood that there was a choice. He took the larger collecting jar from the case with hands that were not quite steady. He crouched, waited, and brought the jar down. The beetle was inside. Then he stood in the wet grass and held the jar up to the growing light, and the chains of pits caught the early sun and gleamed. He had wanted this for 4 years. Holding it now, he understood why the beetle and the figures he had worked through in the night seemed part of the same answer. The beetle had been out of sight, but not beyond reach. Ashcombe had been in difficulty, but not beyond saving. He had confused difficulty with impossibility. The stone had been there all along. He had only to turn it. He stood in the cold, bright morning with the beetle in the jar, and something in him settled. For the first time since he had come into Wiltshire, he felt like himself again. He asked Iris for a private word after breakfast. She came with him to the small morning parlour readily enough, perhaps supposing he had some small wedding matter to discuss. She sat, arranged her skirt, and looked up at him with the bright, untroubled composure she had worn since the trousseau had begun to take shape.
Iris, I have something to say to you that will not be welcome, and I would rather say it plainly than soften it with excuses.
Her composure did not waver.
You sound very grave, Lord Ashcombe.
I cannot marry you. I have thought about it as carefully as I know how, and I cannot go through with it. I wanted to tell you myself before I told anyone else, because I owe you that much at least.
For a moment she did not move. Her smile remained, a second too long, held there by habit rather than feeling. Then it vanished, all at once, and what replaced it was not grief but affront.
You cannot mean this.
I do mean it, and I am sorry for it.
4 days.
Her voice had gone cold.
You have chosen to tell me this 4 days before the wedding. The lace is cut. The whole county is invited. My gown.
She stopped. He saw at once where her thoughts had gone, not to him, but to the ceremony, the eyes that would be upon her, and the future she had already begun to imagine.
You have humiliated me.
That was not my wish. The fault is mine, and I shall say so. I shall see to it that everyone understands.
No, I will not have you arrange the story for me.
She rose and walked to the window, standing with her back to him. When she spoke again, her voice had cooled from affront into something harder and more controlled.
There is someone else.
It was not a question. Edmund said nothing. She did not turn round. She stood very straight at the window, and he saw the moment she understood. Her shoulders went still. For one dangerous instant, Charlotte's name seemed to stand between them. Iris considered it in silence, then put it away unspoken. To say it would have made it part of the story, and Iris would not give any suspicion the dignity of her voice. When she turned back to him, her face had composed itself entirely. She had always known her own worth, and now she drew herself up with all of it.
I shall speak to my mother and father myself. You will not. I will not have you arranging my humiliation for me, as though it were one of your specimens to be labelled and pinned. I shall tell them in my own way, and everyone else will hear only what I choose to have known. You will have no part in telling the story.
As you wish.
I think you had better leave as soon as your things can be made ready, Lord Ashcombe. There is nothing further for you to do here, and there is a great deal for me to do, and I should prefer to do it without you in the house.
I will leave as soon as I can.
She looked at him for a moment longer, not softened, but fully in command of herself.
You might have done worse than me. I should have managed your house very well. I would have made an excellent Lady Ashcombe. But I think we both know it was the title I understood best,
She did not wait for him to answer. She went out of the morning parlour with her head high and her step unhurried. Edmund stood alone in the parlour. Before long there would be voices upstairs, a household thrown into disorder, and a great deal that he had set in motion and would not be permitted to help mend. He had very little time. There was one thing still to be done before he went. He had left it until last, not because it mattered least, but because it mattered most. Chapter 10. Letter. The library was very still. Charlotte sat at the table by the window, a small stack of household notes and the inkwell before her, trying to make the morning proceed as if it were any other. She looked up when she heard him come in. His face told her enough.
Lord Ashcombe.
Charlotte.
He left the door half open behind him. He had never used her name so plainly before. She did not correct him.
I have spoken to your sister. The engagement is broken. She means to tell your mother and father herself, and I am to leave the house as soon as my things can be made ready.
Charlotte sat very still for a moment. Then she set down her pen with extreme care.
Then it is done.
Yes. I have come to tell you I am leaving. I want you for my wife, Charlotte. I will not pretend otherwise. But I am not asking for your answer today. I shall not press you. I shall not ask you to answer me while this house is still reeling from what I have done. I could not leave with you believing that I had broken the engagement in order to force an answer from you.
And have you not?
No. I broke the engagement because it was wrong to marry her. That would have been true even if I had no hope of a life with you.
He took one step farther into the room and stopped there.
You asked me to think of the cost. I have thought of it. I know what this will cost Iris. I know what it will cost your parents. I know what people will say. I know that nothing I do now can make it clean or painless. But marrying her would not have been kindness. It would only have postponed the hurt and bound her to a man who could not love her as she deserved.
Charlotte turned away, toward the pale morning at the window. For a moment she said nothing. Her lips parted once, then closed again, as if she had almost asked the question and could not bear the answer.
And Ashcombe Park,
she said at last.
I sat up last night with the books. I worked them through. If I let the London house go, sell the land at Nethercote, close 2 wings of the house, and live according to my means, rather than the life expected of me, Ashcombe can be saved. Putting Ashcombe right will take longer than anyone intended, and the life will be smaller. But it can be done. I do not need Iris's portion. I do not need yours either. I had been telling myself there was no choice. I had simply not done the arithmetic.
She looked at him for a long moment.
Then you mean to live very differently. No London, no season, no grand entertaining. You will give up things you were raised to expect.
Yes.
And in 5 years, when that life has settled around you and the men of your own circle are in London, while you are at Ashcombe mending fences, you will not think that you gave it up because of me?
No.
You cannot promise that.
He moved as if he would go to her, then stopped himself. His hand closed at his side.
I can. The grand version of Ashcombe was my father's idea. It was never mine. I have spent too long pretending I wanted it because that was what was required of me. I do not want it. I never did.
He drew a breath.
I want the land and the tenants and the work. I want that life at the pace and on the terms I can afford. It is not what I am settling for. It is what I should have been building all along. And you are not what remains after I have given something up, Charlotte. You are the reason I saw the truth of what I wanted.
I believe you.
She was silent after that. Believing him had not made what came next easier. It had only made it necessary.
There is one thing more. I have carried it all this time, and I cannot let you leave without hearing it. I love you. I have loved you, I think, since the morning in the kitchen garden when you told me about Ashcombe. I have loved you with my eyes open. I am refusing you with my eyes open as well.
Charlotte.
No. Please listen. I am refusing you, Lord Ashcombe, for now, not forever. I do not know what the future looks like. I know what today looks like. Today my sister is with my mother. My father is wounded in his own way, and this house has scarcely begun to feel what has happened. I will not give you my answer in the middle of my family's hurt or before the world has had its say. I need time. I do not know how much. I am asking you to give me time, not to write to me and to wait.
He looked at her for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice had lost all urgency.
Then I will not write. I will not press you. I will leave it in your hands as you ask.
He drew a careful breath.
Only tell me this, if you can. How long must I wait?
Until I write to you. If I write to you.
He was silent.
I am not ending this. I am asking you to leave it in my hands for a while.
Then I shall wait.
Thank you.
He took a small plain card from the inside of his coat, his name and Ashcombe Park printed neatly upon it. Then he took up the pen, wrote his direction in Salisbury beneath it, and laid the card on the table beside the inkwell.
I shall be in Salisbury for a few days. After that, Ashcombe Park. I will respect your wishes, Charlotte.
For a moment he seemed about to say more. He did not. He bowed, very slightly, and left the small library, the door still half open behind him. Charlotte stood at the table with her hand still on the back of the chair. Then she sat down, picked up the pen, and continued the note to the curate's wife. Her hands were not quite steady. Edmund left Wrenfield Hall before luncheon, while the house was still moving quietly around the shock he had left behind. He did not see Iris again. Mrs. Wrenfield came down to the gravel sweep as the carriage was being loaded. Her face was composed, but her eyes were very tired. She said only that he had been received as a guest and would be permitted to leave as one. She did not offer her hand. He bowed and thanked her for the kindness he had received, and meant it. Mr. Wrenfield was at the stables, where he had been since the news reached him, and sent no message. Charlotte did not appear at any window that Edmund could see. The carriage rolled down the beach avenue. He looked back once at Wrenfield Hall, and the late September light lay along it as it had lain on the afternoon he arrived. He thought of the beetle he had found on his way to Wrenfield, Pterosticus mudidus, and of how little the man who had stopped to turn that stone had understood. He did not stop on the way to Salisbury. He went directly to an inn and took a private room. There he wrote 2 letters, one to Dr. McAllister in Edinburgh, informing him of the carabus manulis he had taken on Wrenfield Down, and one to an understeward on a Hampshire estate, of whom he had heard good reports, asking whether the man would be at liberty to call at Ashcombe Park within the month. He posted them both that evening. Then he sat in the small parlour of the inn with a glass of brandy he did not drink, and waited for the day to be over. Nearly 2 weeks passed. In the first days after Edmund left, Iris and Mrs. Wrenfield went up to London. They took rooms in Bruton Street with an old friend of Mrs. Wrenfield's, where Iris could wait out the first sharp edge of the gossip among people who knew how to be discreet. She had friends in town, and there was comfort, of a kind she understood very well, in calls and fittings and the knowledge that she might be seen again only when she chose. Mr. Wrenfield stayed at Wrenfield Hall with Charlotte, occupied as ever with the home farm and his accounts, and was kind to his younger daughter in his bluff country way. He did not speak of what had happened. Once, over breakfast, he told her that she was a sensible girl, and that he was glad to have her at home. Then he reached across the table, patted her hand, and went out to the stables. It was the nearest thing to tenderness he had shown Charlotte in years, and she carried the moment with her for the rest of the morning. She walked the grounds a great deal during that time, the garden, the paddock, the lane down to the village, and once the sheep track on the down, where she stood for a while at the hedge and did not turn any of the stones. Near the end of the second week, she walked out into the kitchen garden after breakfast and stopped at the paddock wall without quite knowing why. The morning was clear, and the chalk was bright. She crouched and turned over one of the flat stones at the foot of the wall, near the place where she had once stood, and left the stones untouched, and beneath it was a beetle she did not know. It was large and dark, with wing cases of a deep colour she could not at first name. In the morning light, they showed a clear violet edge, deeper than the colour she remembered from the beetle Edmund had once named for her. She had never seen this one before. She fetched a small glass jar from the potting shelf and coaxed the beetle carefully inside. Then she carried it into the small library and set it on the table, with a little damp chalk beneath the rim. She sat down at her table. She drew a piece of paper toward her and dipped her pen. The letter to Lord Ashcombe was short. Charlotte described the beetle, gave the place and time of the find, and added a small, careful sketch of the wing cases at the bottom of the page, marking the violet edge as best she could. It would not have satisfied Dr. McAllister in Edinburgh, perhaps, but it was enough to show that she had looked closely. She asked for its name, and nothing more. Then she signed it, "Yours sincerely, Charlotte Wrenfield," and gave it to the housekeeper for the afternoon post. When his reply came, it was longer than her letter. It named the beetle, described it, and added 3 small details about the species, none of which she had asked for, and all of which she was glad to know. It said nothing about the time that had passed since his departure, or the words they had spoken in the library. To anyone else it would have seemed strictly a zoological letter. But at the close, beneath all that careful information, he had written one further sentence.
I shall keep this letter as long as I live.
That night Charlotte Wrenfield sat at her small writing desk with a single candle burning beside her. She opened her leather-bound book. She dipped her pen. She held her hand above the page for a long time. Then she wrote, in her clear, careful hand.
Carabus violaceus.
She closed the book, placed it in the drawer, and blew out the candle. Epilogue. The correspondence between Lord Ashcombe and Miss Charlotte Wrenfield began with a beetle and continued, for some weeks, under the polite pretence that it concerned beetles and nothing else. At first her letters described the beetles she found, with the place, the hour, whether the day had been wet or fine, and sometimes a careful sketch. He wrote back with their names, their habits, and notes on where each species might be found. Not long after, his replies made room for the South Meadow at Ashcombe, which had been ditched at last and was draining properly for the first time in a decade. Before long, neither of them could pretend that the letters were only about beetles. Beetles remained the pretext, but the letters had become a courtship. In late November, he came to Wiltshire for 3 days and stayed at an inn in the village. He called at Wrenfield Hall on the second afternoon, where Mr. Wrenfield received him with the grave courtesy of a man who had decided what would and would not be remembered. They spoke of fences. Charlotte came in after a few minutes and sat with them, and the 3 of them took tea. Edmund and Charlotte exchanged perhaps 50 words, not one of them touching on what had passed between them. Mr. Wrenfield was satisfied with the visit. On the 3rd afternoon, Edmund returned, was shown into the small library, and was left alone there with Charlotte for as long as propriety allowed. What he said to her then belonged to Charlotte, and need not be recorded. She accepted him. They walked out together into the gardens afterwards, in the cold, clear November light. By the paddock wall, where she had once shown him what could be found beneath the stones, they stopped for a moment. Neither of them spoke, but Charlotte slipped her hand into the crook of his arm, and when they walked on, they did so together. Mrs. Wrenfield's consent was more measured. She received the news of Charlotte's engagement with a composure that did not quite hide the careful adjustment of her hopes. The wedding she had planned for so long had vanished, and with it, almost, the title she had expected to see brought into the family. She had braced herself for a long London winter of guarded silences and careful appearances, only to find that Iris had been quietly arranging her own recovery. By the end of the conversation, Mr. and Mrs. Wrenfield had accepted the shape of it. Charlotte would, after all, be Lady Ashcombe, and the connection would remain in the family, though through the younger daughter rather than the elder. The wedding, when it came, would be a small one held quietly at Wrenfield. Elegant, if it could not be grand. Within a week Mrs. Wrenfield was writing to her London friend in Bruton Street, setting out the matter in terms that would in time become the version everyone agreed on. Iris was told by letter, She replied to her mother within 3 days, very briefly, and her reply contained no message for Charlotte. She would not attend the wedding. By then she had an engagement of her own. The gentleman was a baronet of moderate fortune, with a London house in Cavendish Square and an indulgent mother in Kensington. Iris was satisfied with the arrangement, which she had secured with the same patience and clear-sightedness she had brought to every question of her own future. She became Lady Hartwell the following spring, and in that role proved exactly what she had always believed herself to be: competent, admired, and very difficult to overlook. She did not see her sister often, but when they met at family gatherings, the two of them were civil to one another. Iris had determined early on that the breaking of the engagement would be remembered, by the world she cared about, as her own choice. She maintained this with the steady conviction of a woman who knew the value of her own version of the story. Edmund, who owed her at least that much, did not contradict her, and within a few years it was the version most people in London believed. Charlotte and Edmund were married in late February at Wrenfield, in a small ceremony attended by perhaps 30 people. She wore a gown of pale blue silk, with a fichu of white lace, simpler than the wedding gown her mother had once imagined for either of her daughters, and chosen by Charlotte herself, with the practical knowledge that it might be worn again. The day was cold and bright. Mr. Wrenfield, who had never been a demonstrative man, wept twice, once at the church door, and once when his daughter put her hand in Edmund's at the altar. He was a little embarrassed by it, and was forgiven. They travelled to Ashcombe Park the next morning. The house, when Charlotte first saw it from the carriage window, was smaller than she had imagined, but gentler in aspect than she had been led to expect. 2 wings stood closed under sheets, as Edmund had said they would. The drawing room that had become his mother's whole world was opened for them on their first evening. Edmund opened the desk and showed Charlotte the small book of notes and pressed leaves kept inside. His mother had arranged each specimen carefully and named it in Latin and English on the facing page. Charlotte opened it carefully and turned a few pages. Then she closed it and put it back into the drawer, knowing that some things were meant to be kept long after the hand that made them was gone. The work of restoring Ashcombe Park took longer than anyone had planned, but came right in ways no one had quite dared to hope. The new steward proved himself within a year. The south meadow drained properly at last. Charlotte took the kitchen garden in hand, and by the second summer it was sending more peas, beans, herbs and currants to the kitchen than the cook knew what to do with. The fences were repaired, 1 line at a time, in their proper order. The Hampshire Beetle catalogue, after a long pause, resumed in Charlotte's hand as often as in Edmund's. She had a clear hand and a careful eye, as she had been her grandfather's pupil in the matter of country natural history without anyone in the family quite noticing. By their 4th winter at Ashcombe, the catalogue contained 612 entries, of which 47 had been taken by Lady Ashcombe herself. The little leather-bound journal Charlotte had brought with her to Ashcombe found its place in a desk in her sitting room, and there it remained, unopened. She had no need to read it. She remembered every word. In their 7th year at Ashcombe Park, on a clear autumn morning, the light came in through the long window of the south drawing-room. Charlotte had arranged the room much as her husband's mother had kept it, with the desk by the window and the little book of notes and pressed leaves safe in its drawer. The leaves outside were beginning to turn. She was at the desk with the Ashcombe Beetle catalogue open before her. The door opened. Edmund came in from the home farm with his boots not quite clean and a small jar in his hand. Beside him came a small boy of 5 or 6, solemn with importance and carrying the net as if it were a military standard. Edmund set the jar on the desk in front of Charlotte. Inside it, a beetle of a deep dark colour was making its careful way along the glass. Without looking in the jar, Charlotte guessed it correctly as Carabus problematicus. The child looked from his mother to his father in astonishment, and Edmund, with all the gravity the occasion required, told him that his mother had long ago acquired the inconvenient habit of being right before anyone had explained the matter to her. Charlotte gave him a look then, because there were some remarks a wife could not allow to pass entirely unchallenged. She drew the catalogue closer and opened it to the next clean page for their son. He might write the date, she told him. His father would supply the Latin name, and she would see that the entry was made properly. Edmund stood beside her chair for a moment in easy silence. She turned her face up to him. He bent and kissed her, then went out again to meet the steward and inspect the new addition to the stables. Charlotte looked down at the open page, where her son's careful date stood beside Edmund's Latin name. Then she added the location of the find in her own clear hand and left the book open for the ink to dry. The end. And so Ashcombe Park is full of quiet happiness, old books, new beginnings, and one very important Beetle. If you enjoyed this tender Regency romance audiobook, another awaits. The Earl's Secret Bride is waiting for you now. A quiet governess, a brooding earl, and a marriage of necessity that hides more than either of them expects. Behind the doors of Ravensleigh lie secrets, sorrow, and a heart that has almost forgotten how to hope. Tap the video on your screen to continue listening. I shall return soon with another romance. Unless I followed a beetle beneath the nearest stone and found an entirely new scandal waiting there.